Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Amanda.
Good evening.
I'm Amanda. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about economics and identity. Because more than any other social science in the world, economics tends to have a very strict and pretty intense understanding of human nature. And this understanding was actually what made me first interested in economics. And I think has some really serious philosophical and practical implications that I hope you will be interested in. So economics, the fundamental assumption is that across space and time, people are basically the same. And what they assume is that people are individualistic, autonomous, rational agents. Or in simple terms, pretty much that we're selfish assholes. And so at the time when I learned this, I was like, oh, well, this is weird. We don't have these types of assumptions, let's say, in anthropology or sociology or political science, right? Like there's different theories, but there are multiple ones. But in economics, there's one, and it is just that. And for me at the time, I was very into feminist theory. And I was like, wait, so if we see the world as having these kind of gender dichotomies, where men are assumed to have more, let's say, rational, individual, competitive tendencies, and these are contrasted with the more effeminate ideas of cooperation or empathy, emotions, and cooperation. Why was it that economics was only looking at one, when obviously we all have both, and the world has to have both in order to even survive? So I was like, okay, let's look into this a little bit and have a better understanding of where this kind of bizarre assumption comes from, because I at least don't identify as that.
As a selfish asshole?
Yeah. So when I started to dig into this question of where this assumption to human nature came from, I realized that it derived from a very specific evolution of Western, religious, and philosophical thought. So if any of you have ever read or studied like early political theory, a lot of it centers on this nature-nurture debate. And so theorists like Hobbes would say that people are just brutally selfish and cruel, and that the whole purpose of any social organization or government is just to make sure that we don't end up killing each other. And so that stemmed from a very particular Judeo-Christian assumption to original sin. And so any of you who aren't as familiar with the book of Genesis kind of know the story whereby man was created to be perfect and righteous in God's image, but then Satan tempted them, Adam and Eve, with an apple. Adam ate it, and so for the rest of time, people were said to be inherently somewhat sinful, whenever they were born. So it was in this context, I want to say, that in the 1700s, the first economic theory was developed. And so with this particular philosophical context and religious context, Adam Smith wrote the most famous quoted, probably economic phrase in the world, is that it is not for the benevolence of the brewer, the baker, or I want to say candlestick maker, but that's not right.
Oh yeah, say it. Right. Yeah.
And the butcher that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. Okay? So what this meant was that we produce and provide for others, not because of their needs, but just because we're doing it for ourselves. And what was so powerful about this idea was that within the realm of economics, somehow our worst, most selfish instincts weren't bad anymore. They were actually good. Because by delving into those selfish impulses, we were actually providing for the whole. And so in that way, we could end up serving others without the government needing to step in or any collective agents to ensure that things were self-regulated. So it was in this way that economics was able to transform tendencies and characteristics that were previously viewed as sinful or condemnable, like selfishness and greed, into characteristics that were actually emancipatory and positive. So what's important about this is that it's not just a theory, and they do grip to it very strongly as a theory. But this theory ends up being transformed and institutionalized in the systems around us. So we build businesses and economies, and we mold them and we adapt them through policies based on these assumptions. We actively encourage and reward people to be very cutthroat, competitive, and individualistic. And a clear indication of this is actually a recent study that was done, which found that 1 in 5, or over 20% of the US Fortune 500 CEOs exhibited clearly significant levels of psychopathic traits. Okay? So a psychopath is described as a person who has no empathy, remorse, or guilt, and who are fiercely individualistic and self-serving, with little regard for other people's suffering or needs. Or in other words, they are economist's perfect man. So now, what's very important to emphasize here is that there's no real foundation to believe that people are inherently selfish. And in fact, anthropologists have proven throughout time that traditional economies were not based on a market of self-interest, but people were actually driven by ideas of reciprocity and gift-giving. So if we wanted to be technically accurate, we should base our economic philosophy of human nature on the assumption that people are inherently cooperative or even benevolent. So there was a really interesting recent neurological paper which showed that if you give a gift, if I give Marcus a gift, for example, right now, yeah? Just because, for no reason at all, economists would consider me to be totally irrational. There's no reason, there's nothing I'm going to get from this. But what would happen is that the pleasure circuits in my brain would actually be stimulated. And so oxytocin would be released. And I would actually experience a reduce in stress. My immune system would be boosted. And ultimately, this would reaffirm a social trust that I have. Now, the same research showed that if I were to engage with Marcus, for example, on a rational economic exchange here, that the opposite would occur. I would end up feeling a little stressed out, my immune system would be slightly depressed, and I would reaffirm a distrust with him. Yeah? So this really shows that we're wired to want to give. Yeah? It benefits me and it benefits you in the same way. It's a win-win. It's not the zero-sum game, which is talked about in economics all the time. Because it actually produces very positive neurological effects for us. But the problem is that we've built a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. So we assumed that people were individualistic and selfish. So we built institutions and systems which take advantage of that. And then people are encouraged to act that way. And ultimately, we then think, yeah, people are selfish and individualistic. Yeah? So this all becomes a reinforcing method. So economic logic is colonizing more and more of our world. It's no longer just within the realm of the economy that we use this type of thinking and these types of solutions or methods for organizing behavior. Our best solution right now to climate change is to try to sell carbon credits, yeah? The right to pollute. We are, in every single small institution, even things like waiting in a line, right? This is something that all of us should equally do because it's a social custom. Now, you can buy your way to the front of the line at a TSA checkpoint. You can do it at a roller coaster park. You can do it in so many different areas. And furthermore, collective institutions that are meant to protect the total, like prisons or even armies, are being privatized and people are being bought and sold like slaves. So what can we do about this? I think that at the very basic level, we need to re-engage with traditional methods of exchange. So try to give and receive without expectation because it makes you happy. And try to engage in alternative currencies and barter systems which allow you to exchange with people and see a human face with that interaction. And try to build institutions which really do reward and encourage alternative values and behaviors. behaviors, ones of cooperation, of communication, of empathy. And at a higher level, I was speaking with Joe outside, I think that this is a truly unique moment in history where things are changing. Paradigms they're rocky, and people are looking for different understandings of how to view themselves and their purpose in the world. And so I think what we need is a clear and compelling alternative framework and story and understanding of our own identity to connect with. Because if all of this environmental degradation and inequality and conflict and unhappiness is stemming from the same system and certain understandings of who we are and what we want to do, wouldn't it be worthwhile to at least consider an alternative?
Yes.
So let's consider for a moment a theory of humanity which builds on an alternative religious or philosophical
Oh, goodness
standpoint.
me. Come on, man.
Okay.
Come on, man.
Sorry, gift that keeps on giving.
That's out of nowhere, man.
Who we try?
So since I've been here, I've been considering the idea of what would an economy look like if it had derived from Buddhist or from scientific thought. Even just the understanding of interconnectivity between all of us instead of our individualism. The third law of Newton's physics, Newtonian physics, is that for every action there's an equal and inverse reaction. And that's very similar to the understanding of karma as well. And so if we started from that premise and we recognize we aren't just isolated individuals, but we're actually fundamentally interconnected with everything around us, I am certain that that would already change our economic policies, our own self-perceptions, and create a more sustainable and reciprocal system of exchange. And what if we were to move away from the obsession with a static human nature altogether, and to recognize, as the Buddhists do, that yes, of course we have wholesome and unwholesome characteristics in us. But that's not really the point. The point is to make sure that we strengthen the wholesome ones, and we reduce the unwholesome ones. Then the question would be, how can we build a system which encourages those better traits and brings out the best in all of us? Because I do believe that we, each of us here, honestly could envision a better economic system than this one. And we could envision one where we do actively encourage and reward cooperation and empathy. But all of this requires that we take a step back and we recognize that the economy is not some abstract thing that exists over there, but that it ultimately has values and assumptions of who we are and what motivates us. And that we, as the economy, as the economic agents who make it up, either conform or challenge these values through our actions, through our institutions, and through our policies. So what I'm saying is that if we recognize we are the economy, then we recognize we can change it. And if we change it, we change the world.